The silhouette of a woman stands before a large window.
My primary perpetrator was my mother.
As a child, I suffered emotional, sexual, physical abuse, some of which caused my hearing loss. As a young adult, I experienced physical, sexual, and verbal abuse mostly in one long-term relationship.
Title: The Nature of Violence Against People with Disabilities and Deaf People. Bonnie L. Brayton, National Executive Director, Disabled Women's Network.
It's affecting women with disabilities so much more than, unfortunately, just about any other issue. I think it's important to understand that the violence is a systemic result of many of the oppressions women with disabilities face. Unfortunately, for many women with disabilities, this is really what their day is made up of different forms of violence, whether it's physical violence or system abuse.
Caption: Montreal. A sign reads YWCA. Inside the Y, women are gathered around a circle of tables. Julie Lafleur, outreach worker. She signs. Subtitles. The forms of violence are financial, physical, non-physical. There are many forms, and we're a small community, so we have to keep quiet. And if we report it, the whole community will know that we are experiencing violence. And also accessibility is a problem for us. We have to hire an interpreter, you have to trust the interpreter, and support workers. Caption: Toronto. A woman on a motorized wheelchair enters a small boardroom, followed by a man using a mobility scooter. Fran Odette, George Brown College. Consultant, Institute for Research and Development for Inclusion in Society.
I actually started to do this work as a result of my own experience of being in a relationship that was emotionally abusive. And I really didn't sort of know what was going on in my life in terms of it being identified as abusive until I started connecting with other women. And it was those conversations with women and their stories that I then started to see what was happening in my life and identifying it as abuse. I later went on to try and find support. And the community that I was living in at that time, there was no abuse services that were wheelchair accessible. So I ended up going somewhere for group counseling, and they had to haul me up and down the stairs every time I would go. And so I was imagining, like, here I am, someone who is, fairly able to advocate on my own behalf and express my needs in the ways that I do. And I thought, if I'm having difficulty finding services, what are other women experiencing?
Caption: Caregiver/worker abuse. A man using a mobility scooter navigates a busy sidewalk.
When you're relying for someone to help you, if you get supported independent living, it's only a couple of hours. The rest of the time, you have to be reliant upon people to help you do the things you do. Well, what if that person, I've heard people say, you mean they're not supposed to cash my check and keep some of the money? No. Then, of course, the next question is, well, if I report that person to the police, what happens to me? What do I do? I usually try to give myself an hour to decompress because of the way he throws me in a chair. I sometimes have spasms for up to an hour, despite me telling him to slow down. Sometimes I have to get angry and use the policy of making him leave my apartment for 10 minutes for him to understand. He keeps telling me to hurry up, which is when I raise my voice and tell him to leave me alone. And then he gets upset and leaves. One of my attendants sometimes didn't listen to what I was saying, so I would get angry. One time, he took my dinner away and left. He was mean. It's just that I don't think he really likes the job. It's just a paycheck for him. He just wants to get through the appointments. I know he's overworked.
A woman is living in an institution, or even when they're at home and they have to deal with caregivers who most of the time are wonderful, but there are situations of being so vulnerable and not being able to find the help because of their vulnerability. And that's a huge, huge problem. We had a woman who called last year because she felt violated by her caregiver, and she had talked to her CLSC, and it was one of those situations again where she was falling through the cracks because of the machine, the bureaucracy. She even told us that that same person was still coming to her, although she had complained about it.
I had great concern about my care worker. I can't take a bath since I wear my brace into the bathtub. I do it myself, and I am careful. But when dealing with external people, I have concerns. These people are supposed to be trained, yet they've treated me and my dad inappropriately. They basically force-fed my dad. So sometimes you felt victimized by service providers who are in authority and can act abusively because there's no accountability.
I was a victim of domestic abuse for 2 years. I was living with a man whom I met. He was nice at first. I was worried, but I gathered up my courage and decided to live with him.
Title: Intimate Partner Abuse.
He would beat me and ridicule me every time I would refuse, for example, to give him money. At first he would just threaten me and I'd give him what he wanted, but when I started saying no, when I had no money, he'd get angry. He would scream at me and he ended up hitting me. During intimate moments, he was also violent. I remember one time we saw each other during lunch break, and when he came up to me to say bye, he kissed me so violently by biting my lip. I even went back to work with my lip completely swollen.
We can say that in the region of Montreal that there are 7 houses that are accessible to wheelchair. But as you know, accessibility is something very general. There's communications and there are other aspects of accessibility. So the women often fall through the cracks. We're also very concerned about the emergency. Women who are in a situation of emergency where they need to leave their home to get help, to get to a shelter. And with a disability, sometimes they cannot leave because, for instance, with the adaptive transportation, there's no confidentiality. And you know that when you're in a situation of violence, you need that confidentiality.
Title: Sexual Abuse. Subtitles: The question of sexual abuse is very complex because the general public does not accept the fact that a woman with disability could be sexually abused. It's already difficult for them to accept that people with disabilities are sexual, that they're desirable. So for people like this, the general public thinks, my God, who would dare abuse them? It's a fact very hard to accept for the general public. When people talk to me about it, they say, my God, no, this can't be happening. Who would dare to do this? It's impossible. These are horror stories. When in fact, they aren't.
Many years ago, I was raped by my brother. I was devastated by my brother raping me. I do not understand why he would do something like that. I still have bad dreams. Another time, it was during Christmas dinner at my father's house, and I think I was over 20 years old at the time. One of my uncles followed me and sexually assaulted me. He hurt me very much. And when I denounced him, he tried to lie and say that I invented it and it wasn't true.
A lot of people think that it's easier to sexually abuse young women because they're vulnerable, especially if the person is in a wheelchair or some kind of mobile device. So it's very they feel helpless because they can't do anything about it, and it just makes me feel awful to think things like that happen almost every single day. If your teacher's in like high school or anything, or like
Title: Youth Issues.
physically abusing you, like yelling at you, calling you stupid, saying that you're wrong about things, instead of trying to listen to you and work with you about how to get around the problems and issues in school.
Title: Cyberbullying.
And like I got bullied a lot. When the bullying is online, like using the internet, it can happen like using Facebook, Twitter, emails, maybe a work website that lots of people use, or a high school website, because then like there's an unlimited amount of abuse that can happen. And a lot of the students who get abused that way, like they try to kill themselves because they're going through so much pain and misery and suffering, and some of them don't want to talk to anybody about it.
It's a double-edged sword.
Title: Men's Issues.
As a man, it's hard to say I was abused. In my experience, some people expect you to be strong, even those with disabilities. You can be strong up to a point. What I went through with the abuse, we were told to be strong, but when we do speak up, we're not even taken seriously. That's what I find. You know, sexual abuse happens for men with disabilities, but we don't talk about that. It's like we're not strong enough to even defend ourselves.
Title: Immigrant Issues.
Many people categorize newcomers and do not give them a chance here. My disability, the language barrier, the fact that I did not know much about my new country, and having a son with autism. Not knowing how to read and write well. My fear and lack of self-esteem. I didn't know how to ask for what I needed.
Julie signs. But also, with regard to immigration for deaf people, people think that sign language is universal. But in different countries, there is different signing. French, English, we have different signing. It's like hearing people. There's ASL, it depends on the country. Here we have LSQ. In different countries, the obstacle is even more challenging for an immigrant who is deaf and has another language. We can welcome them, but we have a limit too. We have to try to discuss, to gesture more, and often we accompany them with an interpreter. Then me as the outreach worker and the immigrant woman herself to see what her needs are. So there are a lot of obstacles for immigrants. There are a lot of barriers. It's worse for them, I think.
When I think of elder abuse, I think of lack of for a person who is physically unable.
Title: Elder Abuse.
I think of the lack of personal care, like changing of a diaper or bathing or doing your hair. Just the personal touches that make all the difference in the world. Aging presents isolation as a natural part of the picture for everybody. And certainly any disability within a senior's life, again, isolates them even further. So, if I could suggest, it's not just certain impairments that cause isolation. It's aging in general, and aging with disabilities even further.
Family is expected to be the support for seniors and the disabled. And very often, family is either detrimental to the person's well-being or not available. I see 70-year-olds taking care of 90-year-olds. I had an incident where I was talking to a gentleman and he was just about in tears. He must have been close to 90. And his son was abusing him. And he was just having a terrible time with this man.
One thing I see a lot of in seniors, I see people after their money. I've certainly seen it in stepchildren, but when it comes down to our own children taking our money, I see grandchildren going after the pharmaceuticals of the grandparents also.
Audrey King, community trainer and advocate.
I can talk about my mother, who lived with me till she was about 101. And in the last 10 years, she had dementia. She was totally helpless. And there were so many caregivers coming in every day. And I, of course, was caught in the middle of trying to coordinate it all and take their distress, but without any authority, of course, unless I paid for them. But some of the things that happened, well, on one occasion she was slapped because she couldn't take her pills.
That oppression, whether it's through the way they're treated by a caregiver, by a person on the bus, by a person in a public space, by a possible employer who doesn't give them the opportunity, that I would say, because we now recognize ableism as a form of violence, that I think that speaks profoundly to why Dawn continues to focus on this area of work.
Title: Systemic Abuse.
It is an abusive relationship within the power struggle. There's no compassion in the system. They tell you what disability you are and how disabled you are, and given the supports according to a box that you're defined in. The staff didn't seem to have any training or interest in knowing about his disability. He's not mobile, and they put him on the table for surgery, and he dislocated something. His hip, I think. He's still not all better.
A lot of people go to healthcare providers for care, but feel like they don't get the care they need and feel neglected. I had to be hospitalized, and I need help with almost everything I do. Being in a hospital was hard because I always came last. Because I need to be fed. I need to be bathed. I always ate cold meals because they'd put it on a table so if everyone else, and only then come back to feed me.
I think when trying to negotiate your needs, whether they're visible and invisible disabilities, it's magnified when they have to engage in the system. And unless you are economically comfortable, you are subjected to the system. And in fact, when I work with people who have to go before the justice system, the one thing that I find helps is having people understand that it's not you that is disabled. It is the system that is creating a disabling effect.
Selma, let's not forget that many of these women are living in a violence situation in which the abuser is often their caregiver, a member of the family, their attendant. So in her immediate circle, these are people that she lives with and knows. So will it be possible for her to report it and still live with these people? Will the support be there? I don't think so. Often women will find it difficult to remove themselves from this circle and live their lives in safety. And you see how these women, some with all of their education and everything they are in society, still have had difficulty reporting abuse that they lived with. A black and white montage shows the women discussing around the circle of tables. The montage continues with the group of men and women in the small boardroom.